Want more CultureScape? Join our Patreon. Get sneak peeks, suggest guests, and join our exclusive Discord. Support CultureScape on Patreon today.
I was something of a child prodigy of role-playing games. I started playing when I was 5 years old, and I was game mastering by about age 7. They have a raw belief that at the end of the day, you can make a product that can appeal to men and women equally. And I do not agree. I think that is actually quite untrue. The tastes are actually much more divergent. They're not even hiding it, right? Like, it's an open agenda that they want to have fewer white men playing the game. You know, the head of the studio for Dungeons & Dragons said as much in an interview. I mean, okay, fine, we'll go elsewhere. What doesn't work is when you say, oh, it's not for you, and then complain that we're not buying.
Hello and welcome to CultureScape, the show that interviews the geek creators and influencers who built nerd culture. I'm your host, Pete Pischke, and today we will be talking about tabletop RPGs. This year is, of course, the 50th anniversary of Dungeons & Dragons, and if you are a fan of TTRPGs, then the last year and a half has been a wild time. Wizards of the Coast, the company that is owned by Hasbro and controls D&D, has been caught in scandal after scandal. And boy, there are a lot of them. From rescinding and retroactively trying to gain control of other companies' games through the OGL license, or the use of AI-generated content in their products, or refusing to publish the game in foreign languages, or the pushing of one D&D in exclusive apps, just to name a few. And that doesn't even include things like Hasbro calling in the Pinkertons on you, or my continued annoyance of the injection of modern progressive pandering and removing and retrofitting every aspect of their games that doesn't fit the current political moment. So, it's not all doom and gloom. See, as Hasbro stumbles, independent creators and small companies are stepping up, crafting their own D&D-inspired games. Today, we're joined by Alex Macris, creator of the best-selling Adventurer Conqueror King System, ACKS or ACKS, and Ascendant. Hailed as one of the most comprehensive TSR-inspired games, ACKS has earned Alex the title of #1 best-selling game designer from Drive-Thru RPG. With the TTRPG landscape shifting and the upcoming ACKS 2 series, we will have plenty to discuss. And if you like what he has to say today, then consider supporting his next GoFundMe on July 18th for his launch of the Star-Spangled Squadron Volume 2, which features in his Ascendant universe. And with all that said, let's get started. Welcome to the show, Alex.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
Yeah, I know. I've been wanting to do this for a while. There's just so much happening in what is a relatively small space. It's been so interesting to watch. We went from during COVID, where all of a sudden there was just a huge amount of people that are really into tabletop RPGs, especially D&D, to now that's kind of letting off. And then we're seeing Hasbro, when they had the bag, they're just now completely fumbling it, to seeing a lot of people saying, you know what, I'm done with the Wizards of the Coast, WOTC, I'm going to go try something else. And whenever I hear that conversation, your game is usually at the top of that list when people are considering, what can I do? How can I get off the Wizards plantation? Oh, you should go and try ACKS. It's the most comprehensive alternative to D&D.
Well, that's good to know. I've certainly had my struggles in marketing, so it's nice that word of mouth is carrying the day.
Yeah, no, I think it is word of mouth. I mean, to be honest, D&D, of course, pretty much created the TTRPG landscape, and I was reading a stat sheet this morning. I think it was 80% of players to TTRPG are D&D players, and then everyone else has to
fight for the other 20%. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then of that 20%, I think a good 10% or 5 to 10% are Pathfinder. And so you're really fighting for the last 10% of the audience. And then that 10%, of course, you're up against powerhouses like Call of Cthulhu, Ruin Quest, Vampire the Masquerade. So it's definitely a difficult space to compete in.
Yeah, it's a very niche. I mean, that's kind of the weirdness of the late 2010s and during COVID was like this thing that was always very niche. That's how it was for me growing up. It was you couldn't get much more nerdy than, like reading Conan and playing D&D. To then it was like, this is very popular. Everyone loves it. Everyone wants to play D&D. And it was, for me, still, even I still have a little bit of whiplash from that cultural shift, and now things seem to be going back to something like a normal.
Yeah, there were a lot of weird things happening during COVID, I think, that made Dungeons & Dragons seem, more mainstream than it probably will be in the long term. You had more people watching YouTube videos where they had the Critical Role shows, people experimenting with virtual tabletops to play online, et cetera, et cetera. So what's interesting about, I think, tabletop games versus, let's say, another niche space like comic books is that with comic books, you can enjoy them regardless of whether anyone else is enjoying them with you. So if you're a fan of Green Lantern, you don't really care that much if someone else is a fan of Batman or Wolverine because you're enjoying Green Lantern. Whereas with tabletop games, they have a network effect because you need to play them with a group. And so you would never have a circumstance where 80% of all comic fans liked one character from the comic universes, right? It's much more spread out. But because of the network effect, it's kind of winner take all when it comes to tabletop games. And Dungeons & Dragons has been the winner most of the time.
Yeah, to the effect that many systems actually were using the OGL license. And they're very TSR inspired, so that, if you wanted to, you could use your D&D materials and then just slot them into whatever other game you were playing.
Right. Because if you're, when you're competing against a network, you want to reduce the switching costs. So, or you want to plug into that network. And with the OGL, they created this enormous network that everybody wanted to be part of, including myself for a long time.
I know it's astounding how much that has changed, because I remember going to games, and this is right when people are starting to use PDFs a lot, and so there's a mix of material that people have bought, or they have PDFs that they probably pirated, let's be honest, or they borrowed from a friend that already owns the book, and it was being like a very open, because for those who don't do tabletop, books like tabletop, especially Dungeons & Dragons, they were $100 minimum. I mean, and you could sometimes go with certain volumes, you could probably get into the $200 range. So very expensive. It's a very expensive hobby in some ways. And so having that openness was like a real plus. And I think it did invite people to try different things out. Because one thing I hear about ACKS that does really well, that other tabletop games often struggle, is what they refer to as endgame Dungeons and Dragons. And the endgame is like you become the lord of a land, or you're a king, or you have some game that's just besides going around bashing monsters. And that stuff is kind of where people have always struggled with. And one thing that I've heard a lot about ACKS is that it's really good at playing with those elements, which is kind of why I am interested in trying out this game with my own tabletop group.
Yeah, so most role-playing games, including massively multiplayer online role-playing games, suffer from what's called the leveling treadmill, which is the idea that you're advancing, but you're not getting anywhere. So at first level, you fight monsters that are goblins and orcs, and it takes, a certain amount of rounds to kill them, and you have a certain percentage chance to hit them, et cetera, et cetera. And then at 5th level, you're fighting 5th level monsters, and you have a certain chance to hit them, and it takes a certain amount of time to kill them. And at 9th level, and so the gameplay stays relatively the same all the way through. In fact, 5th edition, with its bounded accuracy mechanics, is specifically designed to do that. So was 4th edition. ACKS is specifically assigned not to do that. The character power increases the fighters, and not just the mages, but the fighters and the other combatants increase in power exponentially, so that at 1st level, you're like a Roman legionary, but at 9th level, you're Achilles. And so the battles feel very different. And then because you become more heroic on an individual level, that gives you the capability to influence larger scale battles in the way that, say, Achilles shapes the course of the Trojan War. And so then, having gotten that design done, I was able to layer on top a mass combat and domain system for the game. And it creates this really great outcome where, let's say you're playing a fighter. When you level up, you could ultimately become a champion for an army who can single-handedly defeat enemy battalions. You could also level up to become a great general who's really good at strategy and ordering troops around, even if he's not the best frontline combatant. Or you could become a summoner who's able to summon demons to fight on the battlefield. Or, you could be reshaping the battlefield terrain with elemental earth magic or illusions, etc. So it all feeds into this a very large-scale play at the end game. And no other game in the tabletop space does that the way we do.
Yeah, this is, I started, and this is a terrible advice if you want to get into TTRPGs, but when I was a kid, I first got a D&D. My uncles purchased the game, and it was Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. And to the one of AD&D's strengths, so it does have all that kind of stuff that's more at the forefront. Whereas in like you see in D&D now, there are a lot of those rules are kind of in there, but it doesn't feel like there's really an expectation that people are ever actually going to use them, which I kind of find interesting.
Most of the rules, I would disagree. Most of the rules are not in there, and the ones that are in there are generally broken and don't make any sense. They work on the basis of a hand wave. So, for instance, the upcoming D&D rules, 6th edition, the downtime mechanic, is you can spend a month of downtime to gain a level. Okay, so why am I an adventurer then if I can just gain levels in my downtime? And why isn't Bob the local baron 20th level since he grew up as a leisured aristocrat and could have trained, right? Like, it just doesn't make any sense. And they do that over and over and over again. And so you get a result is you get a game that might play fairly fun if you stay zoomed in on just one party in its one little moment. But the moment you try and zoom out and understand how the game world functions, it totally breaks. And it's essentially an incoherency in the simulation of a game world that I personally find really diminishes my pleasure. That's something I've talked about a lot, the difference between a simulationist approach to game design versus a narrativist approach or a gamist approach.
And narrative is definitely where it feels like the more popular, D&D. I think Paizo's a little bit, has a bit more of an even keel, but narrative is very much a foreground. And one of the things they push with 5e and now going into 1D&D is like, this, there's very much about making this character your OC and having this very elaborate backstory, and then it's like, and then the stats and the class and everything kind of comes after that. It feels like that is the way all this is swinging. Whereas in what you're saying, it feels more like old school Dungeons & Dragons, and I think people who are really into tabletop would agree with this, where the story, as it were, the D&D masters basically providing plot hooks, okay, but they're not actually putting out a whole story that you have to keep everyone on rails. If you have a good D&D as a dungeon master, they're just, the story is being made by the players as they engage the game. Whereas, and it feels like where Wizards of the Coast kind of wants to go is they want tabletop now pretty much be a video game.
That's right, they do.
Which is a huge mistake in my understanding of TTRPG design, because it is very different.
I think it's a huge mistake. I think it's a betrayal of what is the essence of tabletop games and what makes them special. You're never going to be able to compete against video games for what video games are great at offering, right? Just like you're not going to be able to compete against movies for their ability to offer visual spectacle and THX sound, et cetera, et cetera. So what can tabletop role-playing games compete in? Well, what they can compete in is the player agency to do whatever they want because there's a live game master there to adjudicate the results and extend the rules if need be, and extend the game world as need be as they explore. And so that is how I define the essence of the RPG, and I call it my theory of fun to design for that, the agency theory of fun, where the goal is to maximize the agency of the player. But to maximize the agency of the player means that their decisions have to have meaningful consequences. Otherwise, the choices are fake choices. And then to have meaningful consequences to choice, that means you actually have to have consequences that are meaningful, meaning your character could fail or die or lose or be enslaved or any of these other bad things that can occur from bad decisions. And so I think in order to make fun role-playing game, you have to permit the possibility of the players making choices that lead them to unfun, to mistake, to ruin, to defeat. And it's in accomplishing the opposite of that, in accomplishing the victory, of having the triumph in the face of that, is where the game takes on so much meaning. It's why people will reminisce about victories they had in a Dungeons and Dragons game 20 years ago, whereas they don't even remember the computer game they played 5 years ago.
Yeah, well said. I'm curious, how does one even get into becoming a role play designer? I mean, you're a guy of many hats. You've been a news publisher, editor. You've done all kinds of things. You're an author. I mean, we talked about a book that you're doing a GoFundMe for next month. And you're also a tabletop designer. How does one even get to being a tabletop designer? I'm interested in what led to that process.
Well, I was something of a child prodigy of role-playing games. I started playing when I was 5 years old, and I was game mastering by about age 7. And you might think maybe it would have been wiser to be a child prodigy of chess or concert piano, but we don't choose our child prodiginess, I guess. So I had many, many years of experience running games. And when you run games enough, you tend to start to hack them, which tends to lead, customize them to your taste, which tends to lead into design. And so by the time I was in high school, I was published in an Interface magazine for Cyberpunk. I had written some freelance stuff for some other games. And when I went into college, I connected with some guys in the professional war game circuit. I started designing war games. I got into law school on the basis of a really cool war game I had designed. They were very impressed by it. And then I put all of that on the way, because obviously it's a rules lawyer, right? So then I put all of that on the wayside, and for many years I was focused on entrepreneurship. Circa 2008, my wife became ill, and I had to be home a lot. But she was asleep in bed, and so I had all this downtime. And she said, honey, why don't you actually, go back to doing game design again? You seem like you really enjoyed it when you were younger, and you're so proud of your games. Why not do them again? And just as she suggested that, the whole crowdfunding movement started. And so it was a confluence of me returning to something that had been a hobby when I was in college, with all of a sudden this new mechanism of being able to fund it by actually saying like, hey, here's my game, give me money and I'll make it. And so those two events worked out really well. So up until 2017, I just did it part-time, though. It was just an avocation. Then I got my sorry ass canceled. And so at that point, I was like, well, I guess I have to find something else to do with my time, because my career in media is over. So at that point, I became a full-time role-playing game designer. The truth is the space is not hugely profitable for the reasons we've already talked about. It's tough to earn a living. My income dropped like 95% the first year I went full-time, and it took me 6 years to sort of clamber back to a living wage. So it's not like anyone should be agitating to break into the lucrative tabletop game space. You can make some money if you get, a home run on Kickstarter, but it's pretty tough.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I don't think I was a child prodigy of anything now that I think about it. I'm prodigyless.
Uh-oh.
No, not everyone. Not everyone. Some people get to be idiot savants. Some of us are just idiots.
Oh. Well, yeah, that was my child prodigiousness was role-playing games. Yeah, I mean, in a really wonderful way. Like when I was in high school, like 14 years old or so, all of my friends were in college, and they would come and pick me up on Friday evenings, drive me to the college dorms, and they're all there with beers and smoking pot, college kids, and I was the game master for them because as I said, I was a child prodigy. And so, here's me with my voice breaking in the middle of adolescence and acne all over my face. I'm like, me works are attacking, But they loved it. I was a really good dungeon master, and I did that for basically 4 years. And that was how I got through high school because it was kind of otherwise a miserable experience.
What do you think about? Because I feel like it's hard. I think a lot of players feel this way, but it's very hard to voice it in a way that it doesn't sound very bad in our current cultural political moment. But I mean, when I think of a classic tabletop game, I mean, there's a lot of that casual kind of bro energy, which is very different than the theater kid energy. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong. Well, I mean, there's something wrong with some theater kids, but I mean, there's nothing wrong with having theater kids, but it's very different. And it feels like with where some people kind of a critical role to they do actually seem like, especially Matthew Mercer does seem to have a passion for games, game design, and a lot of the stuff that's going on there. But many people who are fans of Critical Role, not so much.
Right.
And it's kind of, I kind of like that aspect, and I think that's kind of where maybe many, if not most, players are at. But that doesn't seem like the culture that's being fostered at the moment.
You're saying the
bro
sort of
energy.
bro energy,
Just a couple of dudes,
Yeah. So I think you can have both. It's harder today than it used to be, but like, my old gaming groups, it was, Brian, whose dad is a bus driver, and he has a 71 Chevy that he and his dad built in the garage, and they like to go hunting and shooting on the weekends. Playing right alongside, Jessica, who was a college girl who was like a Wiccan, really into candles and theater, and, next to Pat, who was really into Star Trek. And like, it was fine. The gaming brought you all together, and there was different niches for different people. Nowadays, everything is so partisan and so antagonistic. But the other thing I would say is that to have that bro energy, right? The game, again, it has to have real consequences. It has to be more like a sports team than a theater troupe. It has to, like, for instance, if I do something utterly stupid and get everyone killed, like, the bro energy is like, dude, why did you get us all killed? And it's the same as like, dude, why did you drop the ball? Like, where was your head, man? And that's, you get that. And so there has to be a little bit of a masculine, testosterone-driven sort of seeking out the heroism and wanting the challenge. And I think instead of that, nowadays what we get is what I call affirmational gameplay, affirmational storytelling, rather than aspirational and competitive. So affirmational being, you're okay just how you are, and everything you do is great, right? And so in an affirmational game, in an affirmational story, you never lose, right? It's always good things happen. All choices are good choices. And there's a lot of that nowadays. It's not my jam.
Not really mine either. I mean, I guess there can be a little bit to some extent, but it's part of the thing about gaming. This is true of video games as of anything. You have to have that risk involvement. And it feels like if everything you do is right and you're automatically super special, and so the world is going to conform to what you want it to be, you lose some of that engagement. You lose, and this is a bad word to describe this, but I'm going to say realism, or that connection that you feel to the situation you're in. Where I feel like where Wizards is taking the game, where this is just kind of like, this is just something more casual people will do maybe a few times. I mean, they're perfectly happy with that because casual players, you get them to buy that set. You get them to buy the basic, player's handbook and a few books that one time, and then, they fall out of interest in it. Like, I wanted to pick up trombone. I did a few lessons, I dropped out. Whereas in hardcore players, it's just, they have a different way they do it, and they have a different way you invest into it. Not just gameplay-wise, but financially.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think they're going to find, I think they're going to find that the model they're adopting is going to be a market failure. A lot of people have tried to create mainstream role-playing games that are narrative-focused, that are going to appeal, to a mass audience, and they simply don't, because there are a lot of people who enjoy being passive consumers of story, but the number of people who have the verbal intelligence, the glibness, the self-confidence, the creativity, and frankly, the desire to dynamically narrate stories is very low. It's very small. And if you've ever played some of these narrative-driven games with average people, like, it's really awkward and slow-moving and kind of an unpleasant experience, and they're like, I don't know, and it never really meets the expectation that you would get if you watch 6 professional improv actors do it, right? Whereas anybody with a decent IQ can learn to play, a game where, all right, well, I move forward 10 feet and attack the orc with my sword. Doesn't require that you be a great actor. You don't need to entertain other people with your storytelling prowess. You're just playing a game. So I think they were going to fail. I have two thoughts on that, and I'll save the second thumb for a little bit.
it is a different kind of investment. I do think, though, this is kind of why it was able to grab maybe a more female demographic. I remember in 2018, 2017, I attended like a church young adult. I'm using young adult loosely because these are people from age 30 to 18. And it was the first time I'd seen someone at church besides, another geek that had, had expressed an interest or enjoyment in Dungeons and Dragons. I was a little confused because I hadn't totally caught up to everything that was going with 5e at that point. And I hadn't really seen it before. So I'm not going to say there are no advantages to that strategy, but I don't know if it has any long-term hook, because then it's just one thing of many. And this is like, it's like, that's how fads are. This is just, I'm into this, now I'm into this, now I'm into that, now I'm into that thing over there. And it doesn't really circle back around. The other thing is, I think that they've become so driven on these player stories and these narratives that they want to shift to going to AI dungeon masters, which is what I've heard with 1D&D is they're looking into basically getting AI to do Dungeons and Dragons as the dungeon master. But to do that, they'll have to dumb a whole bunch of rules down. I don't see how those two things work. It feels like if you're going to make it so much more narrative, than trying to use AI to counterbalance that isn't going to work.
No, it's not going to work. It's not going to work. And it's so they are facing the same problem the video game industry is facing, which is that the beliefs under which, in my opinion, the beliefs under which they are functioning are incorrect, right? So they have a raw belief that at the end of the day, you can make a product that can appeal to men and women equally, and therefore make it accessible to everybody. And I do not agree. I think that is actually quite untrue. I think that particularly in things like games, where there's much more interactive agency involved, but even extending into fantasy fiction, the tastes are actually much more divergent than people realize. So I, from time to time, will read some of the fantasy books that my wife reads, and she will, from time to time, read some of the fantasy books that I read. And these books are both sold as fantasy books by best-selling authors, but they are not in the same genres. They are completely different books. And I think that the same thing is true of what people want out of their role-playing games. And in video games, they keep trying to reach this female demographic with games that were historically male, and then it keeps failing and flopping. And then someone comes along with an unabashedly testosterone-driven shooter, and it sells 1 million units and becomes a surprise hit, and everyone's like, oh, that's so weird. Why did that happen? Well, I'm telling you exactly why that happened. So anyway, I think they're going to fail. They deeply misunderstand the audience.
Very, very controversial thing to say. I mean, it didn't used to be. I think people understood that the tastes of men and women, there are guys that'll like more female-driven stuff, obviously, or women that like more male-driven stuff. But generally, if you put it on a graph, women are going to lean more towards liking certain things and in a certain way versus men will like doing it another way. And you could see this even on like social media. Go to Twitter. Women are more likely, in my experience, they'll talk a lot about shipping. They'll talk more about the relationship aspects of the game. Where I think with guys, I more often see posts where they're like, which character is more powerful? Who would win in a fight against Goku?
Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah, I mean, if you read men's fantasy fiction and women's fantasy fiction, I made a riff about this. So imagine it's the exact same story. The story is that the hero is with the army goes to war, there's a battle, and then afterwards the hero gets with their significant other, right? Like the men's fiction version of this starts off with like a war council where angry men are yelling at other angry men about angry man issues until finally the hero angrily solves the matter. Then we cut to the side story of the gritty, loyal, stalwart companions who are nervous about the upcoming battle. Then we have a detailed description of the order of battle so that we know that the author is an expert in 14th century Flemish warfare or something like that, right? Then you have 4 chapters of the battle, and at the each of which leaves you hanging. And at the end, it's a bloody victory, but a beloved side character is killed off. And then there's like one chapter of epilogue, and the hero like winks at his significant other, and that's it, right? And then the female version of this book starts off, and you're in close first-person narrative, and we're all so anxious about the war, and we're talking about our emotions, about violence, and how we fear that we could lose beloved family members, and surely there must be a better way. And then you have about a page or two of them getting to the battle, and the battle's like, one chapter long. And then afterwards, you have 4 chapters of epilogue, 2 of which are sex between the significant other and the hero. And then the final chapter is the hero announcing that in the future there'll be no war, and this has been the battle that saves everything. Like, they're totally different. It's not the same genre. And
Yeah.
I didn't see this until I started reading my wife's fantasy fiction novels, and then I was like, what is this? So I highly recommend anyone who disagrees with me, go read some of those books and come back and talk to me. They are not Conan.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think it's so fascinating, especially too, when you look at like the proportion of literature that's catered to female readers, and amount of it that's just basically adult fiction, but not adult in like mature things. I mean, in like
like sex.
Yeah, NSFW.
Yeah. It's there's so much sex going on all the time. Yeah. I actually got uncomfortable reading some of it. I was like, oh my God, like, can we skip ahead to the battle?
It is a funny dynamic too, because there's the modesty angle, because like one of the contentions, because we just had this thing with the Red Box, for this 50th anniversary, Wizards of the Coast were going to troll people, and they were going to this very classical image. You only see the character's back, but it's obviously like a guy.
And they made it a girl.
Yeah. And the artist Lattimore, I must see Eddie or Edward.
Larry Elmore.
Larry Elmore. Thank you. He does like Conan art, basically. He does like gals in like steel bikinis and
totally
kind of leather headdress and that kind of thing. And then it's like that's just not him. And I think he even came out at one point and was like, no, Gary didn't want that. This guy,
this is definitely a male fighter.
Yeah. This guy from central rural Minnesota in the 70s. He was definitely thinking very female forward.
In my opinion, they're not even hiding it, right? Like, it's an open agenda that they want to have fewer white men playing the games, and so they came out and have said it. Like, the guy who's the the head of the studio for Dungeons and Dragons said as much in an interview. I mean, okay, fine, we'll go elsewhere. I think brands can do what they want. Brands can appeal to who they want to appeal to. I'm not one to say that every brand needs to try and appeal to me. Not every brand needs to appeal to everybody. Totally okay to have Volvos, Subarus, and Porsches for different audiences. All good. But what doesn't work is when you say, oh, it's not for you, and then complain that we're not buying it anymore.
Or just say it was always this way. That's the one that always... I often disagree with these, the conservative side of what is woke, what isn't woke kind of arguments. But I do think when they point out that when they have to say it's retroactively always been that way, I'm like, wait, hold up.
Right. Yeah.
It's mind-boggling. Like, I can't go a week without hearing Wizards of the Coast saying they have to change something that was problematic. I think they got rid of race. They made it species. I think they recently... It's like big things sometimes, but it's also very obscure things. So big thing, like they can't use the term barbarian anymore. They made some changes to... there was a major bard subclass. And then I just read, there like for one of these supplements... I'm trying to think of it now. What used to be called barbarian. They felt that this was offensive to Native Americans, and it's like, I don't know. It just feels like they're always looking for something problematic. Like they're digging to find something new that's problematic so they can come out and say, we fixed it. And I'm like, who is this for? Does it actually appeal to people? Because if they really care about this, you're just signaling to the progs over and over again, actually, we are very politically incorrect. I don't know how that's a good selling point into the people who actually loved 80s D&D or 90s or even 2000s D&D. Heck, early 2010s when you could still play Barbarian. It's
right.
like, well, I never no one in their right mind ever had a problem with any of this. This is just silly.
Right. Well, it's like so the game Savage Worlds, the community used to call themselves Savages, and Savage Worlds, the company that runs them, on their Facebook page now bans you if you call yourself a savage because it's an offensive term. But their game is called Savage World, and they can't change the name because, of course, that's their brand and that's what it's been built around, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's ridiculous. Like, either the word is okay or it's not okay, but it can't be the case that it's okay. But like, if I say I'm a fan of Savage World, I'm a savage. Like, that's silly. That's the world these folks live in.
Yeah, and I've heard. I'm trying to think of the. I feel really stupid right now, but I'm trying to think of the. It was very Conan-inspired setting in a D&D where it's like magic does exist, but it comes at a huge price.
Dark Sun.
Takes place in a desert, and I am just
Dark Sun. It's Dark Sun.
Yeah, Dark Sun. Dark Sun's great, by the way.
And the world is Athos, and magic drains the environment and is what turned it into a desert.
Yeah, and they said we're never going to go back to that, basically because this isn't how they put it, but basically isn't politically progressive enough. There's just too much. We can't fix it, so we're never going back to Dark Sun. Even though Dark Sun
was awesome,
even though it hasn't been used, and I don't think they've hardly put out any materials in a decade and a half. It's very popular.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, but Dark Sun had cannibal halflings. It had sorcerer kings with armies of slaves. It had a race of sterile half-dwarf, half-human gladiators that were raised in slavery. Like, it was not a politically correct setting at all. It was really dark. And nowadays it feels that every setting has to be 2020's Seattle, And if it's not 2020 Seattle, then it's not permitted. So,
yeah, people are talking about currently they released some art for their upcoming stuff, and there were two images, and both of them are horrible. One is where they have a bunch of orcs, but it's like I don't know,
it's like a spaghetti western orcs,
Yes, Hispanic orcs, and it's pretty cringe. And the other one was, and people have said this kind of as a joke, but they seem to be they seem to be trying to live up to the joke, where it's like a coffee shop setting. It's painful.
With the dwarves and like somebody's getting pastries, and it's just ridiculous. It's just ridiculous. So
it is kind of crazy.
That is not the aesthetic of ACKS, and we don't play that game at. Just, ACKS is based on an ersatz Roman Empire. There's blood and circuses, gladiators, evil empires. You crush your enemies, see them driven before you, and hear the lamentations of the women. I mean, orcs are innately evil hell creatures that were specifically genetically engineered as weapons to murder people. Demons are full-on evil and want to destroy you. Like, we just aren't pulling any punches.
Yeah, which, by the way, I don't know why this needs to be said, is an endorsement of any of that. Like, that's great in a fantasy, in fiction. That's wonderful. We're not saying bring back slavery. That'd be a terrible idea.
I do not endorse the creation of genetically engineered warrior races to attack mankind. No, I am strictly opposed to that. I do not endorse summoning chaotic demons from the outer darkness. Strictly opposed to that.
When you're designing these games and when your product, your books came out, what was the kind of feedback you were getting? Like, what do you think players take out of your game or really enjoy about it?
Oh man, so in 2008, roughly 2008 to like 2013, the feedback was really positive, and everybody liked what we were doing. And then from like roughly 2013 to 2017, there was this tidal wave of change, and things that had been awesome in 2010 were suddenly problematic. In that sense, not dissimilar to what it must have felt like to be George R. R. Martin, where by the end of Game of Thrones, people were saying you couldn't make a show like Game of Thrones anymore, right? Like the mores of society had changed so much that, like you remember the rape scene in season 1 of Game of Thrones, like you just couldn't make that show now. Anyway, what people say about ACKS that they really like, the tagline my community came up with, it's kind of hilarious, is they have this little GIF, and it's a guy going like this, and it says, ACKS already does that. And so that's what they love about the game, is that it's comprehensive. You think, I want to run a criminal guild and have thieves working for me running the city. ACKS has rules for that. I want to be a mad wizard in the laboratory crossbreeding monsters. ACKS has rules for that. I want to be an iron-fisted tyrant with a legion of orcs conquering the realm. ACKS has rules for that. No matter what you can think of, like, we've got game mechanics for it. And so it's a very broad and deep rule system. And that appeals to people that want to play in a vivid fantasy world and don't just want the GM to be hand-waving a narrative and making it up as they go.
What are the kind of considerations then you're keeping in when you decide to make another? Obviously, you're moving on to ACKS 2, but when you decide, like, oh, let's do another book, how do you figure out what do players want or what would be a good thing to add?
I just talk to my community. So I have a Discord. I have about 2,000 people on the Discord, about 6,000 on my Twitter, and I just talk to them. And so for instance, I kept noticing that a lot of people were interested in dwarves, right? They posted a lot of dwarf memes. They made a lot of dwarf jokes. And I said, hey, guys, would you be interested if I did a source book that was all about dwarves and we could have rules for mining and mushroom farming and dwarven machinery? And they were like, yes, that would be amazing. So I wrote like a sample chapter. I was like, this is where I'm going with it. And, what do you guys think? And they loved it. And so then that became, prior to ACKS 2, that was my most successful Kickstarter. And it literally came about just from paying attention to what my customers wanted and delivering it to them, which is the exact opposite of what Wizards of the Coast does.
So how is that different, though, than what you're going into ACKS 2? Because when you're, by the way, does the systems of ACKS itself slot in nicely with ACKS 2, or is this more like you're switching from one generation D&D to the next?
No, it's much closer than one generation of D&D to the next. The biggest change from ACKS 1 to ACKS 2 is I had to change the names of a bunch of things, like the labels, because I was abandoning the open game license. So, for instance, I couldn't have a carrion crawler. I couldn't have, a spell, magic missile, things like that, because those were D&D-isms. So I had to get rid of the D&D-isms. So clerics are now crusaders, things like that. Mechanically speaking, they're so similar that I frequently run ACKS 2 using ACKS 1 adventurers and ACKS 1 source books. It's not a problem at all. They're seamless. So what had happened is, in between the writing of ACKS 1 and crowdfunding ACKS 2, is I had spent 10 years improving the game. I had written additional rules. I had written some revised rules that streamlined play in a few areas that were overly complex and cumbersome. I had made expanded options, more character classes. And it was getting to the point where ACKS 1, it was all in there. But on my community forums, people would be like, oh, hey, where can I find the rules for Beastman forces? And then people would be like, oh, that's in the Axioms 2 Compendium issue 4. And they're like, oh, So I thought to myself, let me bring this all together into 3 core books. So it's essentially what, like, in programming terms would be called a refactoring, and in law terms it's called a restatement of the laws. So it was less substantive changes and more bringing together everything that had kind of accumulated over the last decade and rebuilding it.
So then they don't have to go searching as much. They don't have to go through 6 different books to get all the pieces that they need.
Exactly. Yeah, that's right.
For D&D, the shift to PDFs has helped that aspect a lot.
Yeah. We're doing PDF and hardcover. Yeah.
When you do these things, I was reading through some of your books, and you say, well, some of these games are there's like a 5e variant of it. How do you consider other game sets now? And then how does digital work into all of this? When you're designing these books, are you thinking it first as being a physical product, or is digital also a consideration? How are you designing that? How's that changed things?
It has changed things a lot. So most of my books I consider as dual digital and print. And so typically what I do is I have a Kickstarter or other crowdfunding campaign, and by participating in that, you're able to get access to the hardcover version of the books, as well as the digital PDF. Then down the road, I will typically sell the digital PDFs on Drive-Thru RPG, and I might do a print on demand for folks, which is not as nice quality as the crowdfunded. So the best quality books are the crowdfunded. Those are your collectible versions. and I think the industry as a whole has accommodated to that really well. Like, we went through a rough patch for about 5 years where nobody was really sure how to price PDFs, and should you get the PDF if you buy the hardcover, or do you have to buy them as separate products? And now it's kind of standardized that people tend to do their PDFs at about 1/4 to 1/3 the price of their hardcovers. If you buy the hardcover, you get the PDF included. People kind of standardized around that. The new area that everyone is trying to come to grips with is virtual tabletops and virtual tabletop assets. And a big change there is that Drive-Thru RPG, which is the major seller of PDFs, has merged with Roll20, which is the major seller of virtual tabletop assets, and they've now become one company. And I don't think I've got that fully figured out yet. I don't have a great functional virtual tabletop version of my game except on Foundry for the first edition of ACKS, and even that was created by the community, not by me. And I don't have really a lot of virtual assets for sale. So that's going to be a really interesting thing to deal with, because the more you have virtual assets, the more locked in you are to particular game design choices. And I'll give you an example. In writing ACKS, it was clear to me that the game really should use 1 meter or 3.3 foot squares, so that it was 3 squares per 10 feet on a battle map. But D&D uses 5 foot squares, 2 squares per 10 feet on a battle map. And all of the assets that you can buy, all the virtual maps, all the battle maps, the dungeons, are all at 1 square is 5 feet. And so if I had tried to change it to 1 square is 3.3 feet, it actually would have been like making myself not backwards compatible with an enormous amount of product that people would want to use. And so to be part of that network, I had to stick with 1 square is 5 feet, even though I don't think that that's the right game mechanic. And I think as virtual tabletop becomes more and more important, more and more of that is going to impact the design process, and that might get problematic over time.
Yeah, because I could see just changing the amount of distance a character, how you're going to measure the amount of distance that character can move on the field of battle. That means you'd have to go back to all your mechanics that
exactly.
Speed or the amount of distance they travel. You'd have to adjust everything. I could see that getting very messy very quickly.
Right, and the reason it came up in ACKS is because we were simulating ancient battle, and in ancient battle, the soldiers fought. If you had a 60-foot wide frontage, it was 20 soldiers shoulder to shoulder, right? Whereas with 5 foot squares, you can only do 12 soldiers shoulder to shoulder, and so it actually doesn't work. The phalanx isn't dense enough to be able to function like a phalanx. And how do you deal with that when everybody wants to use 5 foot squares?
I see you're thinking about this way more deeply than
I do. I think about this stuff
obviously
really deeply. I think about it more deeply than most folks, even in my own industry. Yeah.
It does seem like, we talked about it, WOTC, how they want to, they're very much in for a virtual tabletop, and they want to kind of frontline this to be more video game-like using AI. I can see where, in some ways, though, having a video game designer seems to be kind of, when you're taking these things to virtual tabletop, that you are kind of injecting more of that game design ethos into the process.
I think that's true.
Do you think virtual tabletop is the future? Because I've talked to some people who absolutely love it, and they think it's very useful. I have a friend who invited me to get into his player group, and I think they are virtual tabletop. But other people I've talked to, they feel like, while it might be a little bit easier in some ways to do virtual tabletop, that something is missing from that physical setting. And then, like you were saying, not all mechanics and not all books play very nice with virtual.
So I think there's a couple things going on. One, there's a generational divide, because the younger generation, Zoomers and Alphas, are much more comfortable with interacting with their friends strictly online. And you see this now where, whereas in my age as a Gen Xer, like in the afternoon, you'd want to go hang out with your friends at their houses. Nowadays, you see a lot of times like they will hang out with their friends online, and they're all doing a chat together, or they're on their phones together, or they're playing a video game together. And like, interesting fact, the percentage of Zoomers and Alphas who are getting driver's licenses is way, 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 way less than our age.
Oh, wow, really?
Yeah, you can look it up. They're just not interested in getting driver's licenses because they don't see any need to go anywhere. Everything's on their phone. Why do I have to go anywhere? I'll just order the food I want. I'll talk to my friends on my phone. I just am in my bedroom. So their relationship to a virtual tabletop is going to be really different than the relationship of a 50-year-old player who's used to getting together with his buddies, having some beers and pretzels and playing. So I think for the older generation, the virtual tabletop is valuable because it lets you play with your friend Bob, who moved to Utah while you still live in New Hampshire, right? And you really miss Bob, and you miss Steve, who lives in California, and Jimmy, who's moved down to Florida. So now we can get the gaming group together. And I did that recently with my own college buddies. So my Gray Brotherhood campaign that I run online on YouTube is my old college buddies and my brother. And we're all scattered around. So I think that's the appeal for the older folks. For the younger folks, the appeal is, this is great. I can just stay in my room and I don't have to interact with actual human beings. And for them, that's kind of a win. Now, because everybody was locked in for COVID, we have to add this third component, which is that for a while, everybody was locked down and wasn't allowed to leave their rooms or their homes. And now they are. And so you're getting this reaction where actually the ability to go and communicate face-to-face with other people is really important. And so you're getting like these board game cafes are opening up and board game restaurants, and the desire for more first face-to-face interaction. Jury's out on how it all shakes out in the end. If in 5 years there was a huge reaction and it turned out people hated BTT and it's all about playing face-to-face, I wouldn't be that surprised. At the same time, 5 years from now, if you told me everybody plays VTT, I wouldn't be that surprised. So I'm trying to keep a neutral stance and support.
Okay, so you're kind of feeling like, which way is this going to go? Because obviously you don't want to invest something that's not going to still be there in like 5 years.
Exactly. Yeah. So I think I'm trying to support both. And so with ACKS 2, I'm doing the first time I'm doing official virtual tabletop support.
What do you think of these pop culture? It sounds like this is the way that this. I don't think Wizards has ever announced anything, but this is a theory that I've read that might hold water. Was one of the reasons why they didn't want the OGL around anymore is because they saw with Magic the Gathering huge success in doing sets where they were like, this is the Lord of the Rings version of Magic the Gathering, or they even did at one point Baldur's Gate 3 set. And the thought was, well, but D&D, there are alternative books out there that like there already was something kind of like a professional but especially homebrew version of Lord of the Rings. So they could, to get rid of that competition, they were just going to cut them out. What do you think of like these fad flavored games? Do they last a length of time? Is that the kind of stuff people actually want?
So it's a good question. I'll give you, first off, I think you're right that is a concern for them. So if you look, the Conan license, one of the biggest licenses in fantasy, for a long time, there was a D20 Dungeons & Dragons style Conan game that wasn't published by Wizards of the Coast. Someone took the D20 rules for Dungeons & Dragons under the open game license and then made a Conan game and got the license from Conan and made a big bundle of money on the Conan property using Dungeons & Dragons rules. And that irritated the hell out of Wizards of the Coast. Likewise, the Middle-earth license, Lord of the Rings license, was not held by Wizards of the Coast. Someone took the D20 open game license rules and they made a Dungeons & Dragons for Middle-earth called Adventures in Middle-earth. And again, they made a bundle of money and it irritated the heck out of Wizards of the Coast. So because they've got their own Lord of the Rings Magic the Gathering set, ain't nobody doing that. Yeah. In terms of, do they stick around? Not really, but it's not because of the game. It's because the license holders, it goes like this. If the game is not successful by their terms, which a tabletop role-playing game will almost never be, because it's a much smaller space than movies and books. Mm-hmm. If the game is not successful by their terms, they yank the license. And if the game is successful by their terms, then they think, oh, we better bring this in-house. This is a lot of money. And so the licenses constantly get taken away from the game company. So West End Games had the Star Wars license. Then they didn't. Mongoose had the Conan license. Then they didn't. On and on and on and on. And so nobody can build a steady brand based around these IPs. So the most successful companies have been the ones that have created their own IPs that have lasted. So FASA with Shadowrun and BattleTech is a great example. BattleTech is now its own IP. You can read books about BattleTech, video games about BattleTech. There's BattleTech arcades. and it all came about from a tabletop game. Same with Shadowrun or Forgotten Realms and Dungeons & Dragons.
Yeah.
So I think the real value actually is in IPs of the properties and not in licensed IP.
You were right. They're kind of short-lived. I can remember there was a short-lived Doctor Who TTRPG. I remember playing. It was like they came out with like maybe 3 books, maybe 4 books. It was like a DC.
Yep.
Like DC Comics. I thought it was all right, but it didn't last any length of time at all.
Likewise, the James Bond. There used to be a James Bond licensed RPG.
Oh wow.
Yeah. It's just nobody can keep hold of the licenses.
You see, this is why I used to play GURPS and. GURPS, which is like, it can almost be anything, but it's very, very generic anime.
Yes,
I feel like going with the generic, and it is kind of like that. In some ways, I think original D&D did kind of, because obviously it was taking huge inspiration from Tolkien. I think there is something to be said about being kind of so generic that no one can take it away from you.
Yeah, so there's the be so generic no one can take it away from you, and the other though is to become the trope maker. Like, if you look at BattleTech became the trope maker for what American mecha is like. It's different from Japanese mecha. They're more like walking tanks, and they have these opposing different houses, and they have these civil wars, and it's got just really full-fledged universe. Another great example, Warhammer 40K, right? Comes from a tabletop game, and now it's an entire IP. And if they're so much better off for having developed the Warhammer IP than they would have been had they licensed somebody else's IP, right?
Warhammer 40K is great, even if there are some kind of weirdness happening with some of these, but
yeah, I mean they're doing a little bit of Wizards of the Coast type shenanigans as well, but yeah, it's what it is.
Is there something to say that because your company, you own it directly, it's more privately held, whereas then you go to someone like a public corporation like Hasbro and Wizards of the Coast? Do you feel like there's a different? I feel like if you have these big, I can use big loosely, but you have, because tabletop is very niche, admittedly.
Right.
You have these big RPGs that are controlled by these public corporations. Part of me feels like there's a level of trust that you should never really give to them, because they're always going to be holding to doing the short term, whatever can help the stock. I mentioned it briefly in our intro here, but one of the shocking things of last year was there was a very healthy demographic of Dungeons and Dragons players in Brazil, but because this was among the bottom 10% of the performers for Wizards of the Coast, Hasbro just cut it out, and they're like, we're not going to print any more books in Portuguese, even though we make our books in China. We're not going to do simplified Mandarin anymore. we're just cutting it out. And I feel like as a player, like, I don't want to give them my trust anymore. Like, maybe I want to lean towards someone like ACKS, towards yourself and your company Autark, because I feel like they aren't just going to throw everything away if it will merit a quick buck.
Right. Yeah, the problem you're describing, I think, is endemic to all publicly held companies in the United States, right? Because the executives are paid essentially for making the stock price go up on a quarterly basis. And they are not paid for spending money now that builds value that's exploited in 10 years, And so I think Wizards of the Coast is absolutely suffering from that, because they had a couple of years where, because of COVID, they had above market returns, and the CEO the guy who was running Hasbro the guy who was running Dungeons & Dragons got promoted to be the CEO of Hasbro as a whole. And so the question is like, well, what's the next rabbit in your hat that you're going to pull out? And the answer is there isn't one. You benefited from an environmental thing, and now your stock price should probably go down because you're no longer benefiting from that. But that's not an answer you can give if you're the CEO and you have one chance to make your buck, with your big stock option. So it's a big problem. The one that really makes me laugh is the publicly traded funeral home businesses, because they made enormous bank during COVID from the excess mortality. And just imagine you're the CEO who inherits the funeral home business after COVID, and they're like, what are you going to do to raise the stock price? You're like, I don't know, bird flu?
I don't know. Can't we release any axe murderers? Is this
Right? Yeah, yeah, exactly. It's just a broken part of our system, but nobody wants to admit it. It's badly broken.
It does. It is funny because it's listing them because it's sad. Hasbro has been so mismanaged. I think I read in one report they think that 60-70% of the value of of the revenue that they're bringing in currently for Hasbro is through Wizards of the Coast, and that's largely because of the game division. Baldur's Gate 3 was this huge, this mega surprise, but it was a game that was made over 6 years and more, 6 years in active development, but more pre-development or yeah, I got that right, pre-development. And it's like they're saying, well, Larry's no longer to make the games. They say it was their own decision. I don't know if I completely buy that, but okay. And they're saying, well, we're going to release the Dungeons and Dragons game, every year or every other year. And it's like 6 years. You want to do it in 2. I don't think this is going to end very well for you.
Right. The only people that have been able to pull that off is Ubisoft, because they have, I think, 3 or 4 different studios. And so each, they do repeated Assassin's Creed games, but each one is being done at a different studio at a time, right? And so they're always able to keep it like this. Wizards has effectively no infrastructure to do that. It's impossible for them. They could get there if they were willing to make those investments, but they're not, right? They just want easy bucks. So, yeah.
Oh, it's too bad. It's too bad. Because I feel like tabletop, it is a really special thing because it feels like it's one of those things. It's not... Yes, you consume it as a product, like you buy the books, but really it's a cultural, personal investment. To really get good at it, to really enjoy it, you have to put a lot of time and energy. There's a social networking effect. It's not something that should be a quick cash in, but unfortunately, it's owned by a publicly traded company that is very much the I keep using the word a lot today, but ethos. That's the word of the day, guys. Ethos. The ethos of the day is very much getting that quick cash in, and I feel like those things are just too opposed.
They are. And what I think will happen is that it will flop. Not necessarily flop in the context of, now it won't have 80% of the market, but rather now it'll have 70% of the market, and the market will have shrunk, right? So internal to our space, it's still going to be the dominant player, but the space as a whole will shrink in size, and they'll lose some on the margins. But from the point of view of Hasbro, it will be a flop, and then they will sell it off, and it will probably get bought out by some other company. Maybe Tencent has expressed interest in purchasing it. Maybe it'll be a hedge fund, who knows? But someone else will buy the brand.
That'd be terrible.
I would be really surprised if Hasbro still owns it in 5 years.
That would make me really depressed because I live in South Dakota, and I've been to the area where ACKS is from. That's just in central Minnesota. That's not too far from here. And it would make me so depressed if it's this, it's owned by a Chinese company that's backed by, the Chinese government. And it's like this wonderful Midwestern thing that started, and it's just, not even here in the United States. That would be sad.
That would be sad, yeah. But at least we might finally get a good China supplement out of it.
True.
You could finally get a good Kung Fu Dungeons & Dragons game.
I liked that. I just hate this culture where we're always looking for things to nitpick and say, not only say it like it was bad, like it's one thing to say, well, this is a bad taste, or this could have handled better, instead of saying like this is the worst thing that's ever been done. I feel like they turn to some of those like the Eastern books of D&D, some of them which, by the way, are very good. I would highly recommend if you're interested, if you like 3.5.
Yeah, I loved a lot of those books. I loved the original Oriental Adventures by Gary Gygax. It was a great book, Swords of the Daimyo by David Cook, which was the first supplement for it. Fantastic. But nowadays not acceptable.
Oh, it's just too bad.
When Tencent takes over, it'll be fine.
They don't have this quite the same incentive structure.
No.
It just feels wrong to me. Just feels kind of wrong, like, for them to own it. I can't quite say why.
You know what'll happen is that instead of getting XP for treasure, you'll get XP for loyal service to the party.
They add the party government mechanic.
Right. There's a commissar role. So there's like one player is the party leader, but then there's a party commissar, and his job is to make sure that they obey their alignment.
Oh yeah, there'll be a class where to maintain your it's kind of like Wizard, but you're just reading the same book every day.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. Yeah. There's no new books. There's only this one book.
Uh,
Good times.
so if someone did come to you and they're like, because you mentioned Shadowrun. Shadowrun was adapted into some decent video games. I think
Yeah,
they
totally.
do. Vampire the Masquerade. There's at least
Yep.
one pretty good video game. Someone says it comes to you and they say, Andrew, we would like to take your property and turn it into a very in-depth RPG. Would that be something you'd be open to?
Yeah, of course. Of course. I mean, I'm actually partnered with a fellow already, and he's put together a small team, and we're working on an adaptation of a fraction of Adventurer Conqueror King, the Domains of War mass combat system, into a video game. So absolutely, I have lots of experience in the video game space, lots of experience in the media space. I feel like I'm well suited to be managing, quote unquote, a transmedia brand, that appears in books, comics, video games, shows, etc. I just have some reputational disadvantages in that regard that I'm working through.
Yeah, I don't. It frustrates me because the people who are currently kind of, I'm not going to say in control, because this is a wonderful thing about tabletop is there's not really anyone in control because it's the players.
Right.
So
Right.
this is kind of thing where like Wizards of the Coast, they want to focus so much on lore at the moment. And like, I love lore. Like many times, even if I don't have a player group at the moment, I'll just like I'll open up, often I love 3.5 especially. And I'll be like, oh, I'm going to read the necromancy supplemental book, which is just fascinating. And I'll just kind of enjoy it. So I like lore, right? But the problem with lore is each group that plays, they're kind of in their own universe in many ways. They may use the lore, they may not. It's up to them. And I kind of feel like that is a misfocus of what players want to get from the game. So it frustrates me because those who do have control, quote unquote, unlike in the social media space or in the news space. By the way, Dicebreaker was just killed off, but Dicebreaker was like the only really, well, it was near the popular press that I thought was pretty reliable and reporting on tabletop, and not just D&D, but like all kinds of RPGs. They're just gone. They've been just, yanked because IGN has decided to buy as many media sites as they can, so they can just shutter them.
Yep.
That's awesome.
Good job.
Wonderful time we live in.
Thanks so much.
But it feels like your game comes up, and so there'll be people like, wow, ACKS is amazing. And then you'll have, who knows how many comments, well, you can't like it because Alex Macris, he did this and that. He was pro Gamergate. He was briefly part of a news media venture with Milo, so he supports the alt-right. No, but it's like saying like, well, because he was this, then you shouldn't buy any of it. And if any of you that say you like it, it's brigading, or worse, you should be banned.
Yeah.
I feel it's silly because it's like, especially when I cover some of these things, especially it's like really niche. It's like niche, right? It's like there's not that many of us. You don't need to start like trying to take each other down. There's like 10 of us in the room. It's unnecessary, but that is what happens, and it frustrates me.
Here's how I look at it. So first off, I have a general rule. I don't go where I'm not. So, RPGNet didn't want me there. They banned me and banned discussion of me. Fine. So if you go through all my social feeds, I don't spend time bad-mouthing RPGNet. I don't make fake accounts to try to log in to promote my games on the fly or to cause them problems. I just move on with my life. So that's like A. B, I believe in free speech. I believe in free enterprise. Nobody is obligated to say nice things about me. Nobody is obligated to buy my games. If people want to say that they suck or I suck, they're welcome to. Where I draw the line, though, is when people actively lie about my beliefs. I mean, there are people who will claim like Alex Macris is literally Osama bin Laden and is personally responsible for the death of dozens and hundreds of people. Like, it's absurd, right? But I have no way of doing anything about it, right? Yeah, but that's where I draw the line. So I try and take a very centered view on this because otherwise it's too It's too much. I do think the wind is shifting, right? I think people are beginning to realize that some aspects of cancel culture are really absurd and their tolerance for it is declining. And as with anything, like, the more you clench your grip, the more star systems will slip through your fingers. So star systems are slipping through the fingers, so they're clenching their grips tighter than ever, right? Like, they had to ban me on Reddit OSR and Reddit RPG because otherwise too many people would have said nice things about me, right? So, like, if it was the case where people were never saying nice things about me, then they wouldn't have had to ban me because nobody would have said anything at all. Yeah. That's how I try and...
That's a nice attitude. That's very positive.
Try and stay positive.
I'm so skeptical. I'm such a cynic these days. So I have a hard time finding the positives, if I'm being completely honest. But I think you were right. At the very least, I think people are calling BS on it. But I don't know if when they do that, they then disengage completely. Because that's what we're seeing in, like, Star Wars and some of the bigger franchises.
That's right.
And I don't know if that's going to continue its way down. Like trickle-down economics. If trickle-down cynicism is going to come through and everyone's just like, I'm done with it.
I don't know either. One of the things I think has been most interesting has been the eye-opening realization that for a lot of these creators, they would rather lose money over and over and over again than actually listen to the audience that they have contempt for. And I think Disney is by far the worst perpetrator of this. Like, the first movie, like, it was a little out of step with what the fans wanted, by now you look at it and you're like, wow, your show got a worse rating than the Star Wars Christmas special from 1979. Like, you have to be actively aware of what you're doing, and you're doing it anyway out of contempt and hatred for your audience. I don't have time for that. I don't buy from people who hate me. I've completely dropped it. I used to be such a Star Wars fan. I'm totally out of Star Wars. I don't pay any attention to it anymore. Same is true of a lot of stuff like that. And I think more and more people are getting there. As the hatred becomes more manifest, the contempt becomes more manifest.
Yeah, it's unfortunate. I mean, you can say what you want about the Star Wars Holiday Special, but it is very funny to talk about in retrospect.
Right. No, for sure, because it was a more innocent age. And, or like, do you know about Starfleet Battles? Have you ever heard this story?
Shoot.
Okay. So Star Trek, TV show, 3 seasons. From Paramount's point of view, a 3-season TV show it was a high-budget show that didn't turn a big profit. Was doing okay in syndication, had some rabid fans, but, Paramount didn't really care about it. And so they get approached by this company called Armadillo Design in Texas, which says, hey, can we license Star Trek to make a war game? And they're like, sure. And so they get the right to do the Starfleet Battles war game, and they get to use Starfleet and Enterprise and Klingons and Romulans and everything. And because Paramount essentially gave no shits about the brand, their license is amazing. It is perpetual, and no one can ever take it away from them. And so then when all of a sudden they woke up to the power of geek culture, and so now there's the Star Trek computer games and the Star Trek board games and the Star Trek novels and all these Star Trek TV shows. Nevertheless, those guys down in Texas still keep having the rights to Starfleet Battles, and it's evolved into an entirely parallel Star Trek universe because their rights cut off at the moment when they got the license. So everything prior to 1970 something, they have the rights to, but nothing after. And so it's an entirely different Star Trek universe, and it gets to have the symbol, and it's got the ships, and it's got, red shirt, everything that you remember from the original series. Hilarious.
It is hilarious. I think it's fantastic. I love that sort of thing. And if I was at Paramount, I could see why you would think it was a negative, but in some ways I feel like this is almost free publicity. This is almost free, like, you're pumping up the base fan base.
Yeah.
There's a lot of positives to it. I wouldn't necessarily see it as a negative.
No, I wouldn't either, but, they did, and they tried to do all their shenanigans, and they lost. I think Starfleet Battles helped keep Star Trek alive while Paramount was ignoring it, and then when Paramount started paying attention to it again, then, the fan base was still out there because of people like that.
Oh, definitely. Doctor Who is probably the best example of this. It was relative. I mean, it was somewhat popular, especially in the 60s, but it was always kind of, it's just kind of, it's like, it's there, it kind of comes and goes. It goes off the air for 15, almost 20 years, and it was kept alive entirely by the fans. They built up a decent amount of interest, and then, of course, everything that came after. And it was like having that base level of fans who can engage with it. It makes a big difference. I know it doesn't feel like that because it's like we get all our money from selling to the normies, but that energy, I think that's what we see with Marvel. It's like the people who are really into Marvel comics, who are really into geek culture and the lore, that they're just not as interested. I think we mentioned trickle down. Maybe this is trickle up. I think something is happening where like the energy like starts the base level with like the super geek, and then that kind of gets infused up as it goes. And if you cut them out, I feel like that's hurting a critical part of your ecosystem.
Agreed. Okay, so you're a big Doctor Who fan?
Yes, ridiculously so.
Okay, so I've maybe seen one episode of Doctor Who in my life, so I need you to explain something to me.
Okay.
Why do people on Twitter keep telling me that I should be cast as the Master in the next Doctor Who?
I don't know. Maybe you have a certain look. You have a certain look. You kind of look a little bit like Robert. I was gonna say Delgado. That is not correct.
Like, because it happened once, I thought it was a joke, but now it's happened multiple times that people are like,
"Oh, I did get it. It was Robert Delgado. I'm impressed."
What does Robert Delgado look like?
Well, he has kind of has a swarthy. He's kind of like the baseline here. Can I screen share? Let's see here.
Oh shit. Okay, I get it now.
He's a little bit swarthy. He's British, and then after that, like for the rest of Classic Who, is pretty much a play on that. So like even when they had Ainsley, who looks very much like Delgado, was kind of playing on that. And you don't really see like a super different looking Master till you get to the new series.
Yep. Okay. I see it now. Yep. Wow, I should be the next Master. That's awesome. Well, now I have a career goal.
That's Doctor Who. I need to do an episode on the show talking with some people who have some kind of connection. I mean, we did one with Gareth Roberts, and that was really cool, but that wasn't so much Doctor Who as it was like his career personally. It is hard because, I mean, I love doing this show so much because I love celebrating geek culture, but there is always that little bit of a lament because it feels like geek culture, after it went mainstream, it feels like some of what made it so special was lost in the process. I mean, maybe it'll just come back. These things are now lowering in popularity. The interest in something like even the MCU, what was the almighty MCU, which was like the most successful movie ever when it came out with Endgame in 2018. And now it's like people aren't interested. They lose a ton of money on the films and the TV shows. Maybe it'll come back. Maybe because they lose interest that people will try to pick up the pieces, but maybe not. And maybe this, what we feel as the classic nerd, maybe this is just something that was really special that got going in the the 20th century to the late 20th century into the early 21st century. And maybe that's it. Maybe it doesn't have a length longer than that. But
so I have a theory on why geek culture became cool. I actually have a theory on this. So,
okay,
in my opinion, cool arises when young people, by taking risks, are able to become incredibly successful, right? So an accountant who keeps his nose to the grindstone, works 60 hours a week, can guarantee that he will be upper middle class or even upper class by the end of his career if he saves and works hard. But being an accountant is not cool because you're 60 by the time you get the payoff, right? Likewise as being a corporate attorney, being a proctologist, things like that, right? You can definitely get wealthy, but you get wealthy when you're middle-aged. Rock star, football, baseball, rapper, YouTube influencer, these are all things that a small select group can do where they get wealthy at a young age. Starting in the late 1990s until the early 2010s, in computers and in other geek fields, it was possible by taking risks for a small percentage to become very, very wealthy. You had the whole .com generation. And so suddenly it became cool to be geeky. It became cool to be a .commer. But now most of those opportunities are closed off. Big tech oligopolies are established. Very few teenagers are becoming .com millionaires anymore. Now it's more social media is where they're looking. And so social media influencers become more cool. And that's leading into sort of a different kind of geek space, a different kind of space that isn't the tech geek space that dominated in the prior generation. So I think we're going to see a sea change sort of in some norms in that regard.
Interesting. Does that mean though that because I can definitely remember this is kind of one of the weird things about tabletop RPGs, at least especially Dungeons & Dragons, where when I played the game as a kid, even to middle school and high school, it was something that definitely when I was in a more churchy environment, anything could be said, just like anything. But it's you go to school, you might get bullied some. I mean, it was definitely something that wasn't necessarily beloved by the main culture.
Yeah.
Are we going to go back to that? Are people going to return to bullying Dungeons and Dragons and tabletop players? I wonder.
I don't know. I don't think as much. I don't think there'll be as much bullying about it. I think bullying has evolved in different ways now with a lot more online bullying based on not getting enough likes and things like that. Seems to be my sense. It's it's of a different nature than it used to be. Yeah. I think it'll be more, or let me put it another way. Everybody gets bullied now online. It's just who's bullying you and why, right? But you can say anything you want on Twitter and you'll get bullied. Someone will be nasty to you about it. And it never turns off, which was different for me. In high school, I could go home and then I wasn't bullied anymore. Now I was at home.
Yeah. And they weren't following you to work and they were like, I don't think you should be able to work at McDonald's.
Right. They didn't call my pager and I'd go call them back and be like, you suck. Oh, I've got another call. You suck even more. It just didn't work that way. Nobody paged you to let you know you suck. But people will go out of their way. They'll stop what they're doing and be like, I really need to let this guy know how wrong he is.
It's very important.
Yeah. So I don't think we're going to go back to the old way of bullying. I just think it'll be less cool. Right. You'll have a harder time finding players. The game shops will have fewer people in them. And it'll be more of the stereotypical player type rather than the broader player base we've had. That would be my guess.
Okay. Well, we're heading into 9 minutes, so I'll start trying to wrap this up. I do have this is kind of unrelated, but you said you got started as a kid, and you seem like someone that, to me, that maybe was growing up in the 80s, which, by the way, was the middle of the Satanic Panic, which is why D&D Edition 2 doesn't have, got rid of hell and devils and all kinds of stuff. Do you remember any of that? How did people look at you?
Oh, yeah. So I was born in 1975. So it was 1980 when I first started playing. I was 5 years old. My two older brothers were in the Dungeons and Dragons Club in high school. Because that was the peak. That was when Dungeons & Dragons was on ET and the basic set was available in Walden books. So that was the first fad phase. And so there was a Dungeons & Dragons Club in high school. They were part of the Dungeons & Dragons Club. I started playing. The Satanic Scare comes a couple years later with Tom Hanks and Mazes and Monsters. And so that's early to mid 1980s.
It's a terrible, by the way, I've seen it. It's a terrible TV movie.
Yeah.
I can't believe it.
My parents gave absolutely no shits about any of that. In fact, my mom sat down with me and with colored pencils, she used to to color in the monster manual. So I have a copy of the first edition monster manual with the naked succubus. And my mom has colored in pencil and she's done the nipples and stuff, right? She gave no shits about any of that stuff. And in fact, my mom, she named me for Alexander the Great. She named my brother for William the Conqueror. And when other kids were getting Dr. Seuss, she was reading us the Iliad, right? I kid you not. So, and then Achilles killed her, I'm oh, okay. So I had, my parents were kind of walking to the beat of a different drummer with regard to mid 80s Americans. I did have a very good friend named Fred, whose parents were rabidly part of the Satanic Panic fear. And so he was not allowed to play Dungeons & Dragons. But bizarrely, they let him play Cyberpunk because that was science fiction, didn't have anything occult in it. Of course, Cyberpunk is filled with drugs and gratuitous sex and mega violence and soulless corporations, and they were totally fine with that as long as he didn't play Dungeons & Dragons. And so finally, in like our final year, they relented and they let us play. They said you can play Dungeons and Dragons, but you have to, you have to come play it at our house because we want to see what it's like. And me being me, I show up and I'm like, hey, Mr. and Mrs. Fred, where can I set up the pentagram?
Oh my gosh.
Wow. Anyway, it didn't go well.
That's such a weird time in history.
It really was. Yeah. Yeah.
It's amazing.
You remember Summoner Geeks? I cast magic missile against the darkness. Have you seen that?
Yes, I do. That was especially online, it was like earlier meme culture.
It really was early meme culture. Yeah.
I do love that one. Have you seen? I think that there are 2 films. I think they're called Dorks. Have you seen that one?
I have. I've seen. Yeah.
I love Dorks.
Is Dorks the one when he accidentally summons the real demon? Is that Dorks?
Yeah. The most of it's like the meta of like inside their own role playing game.
Okay, that's a different. But I have seen Dorks. But there's also one I really liked where like they accidentally summon a real demon of the LARP, and that was pretty.
That's kind of when if you've seen Dorks, when I talk about that's the kind of culture that I grew up in, right? That's what I think of as a classic.
Absolutely.
Which does have women, right? Women are there. It's not like they're not.
No, that's right.
But
that's right.
It definitely leaned a certain way. A lot of passive aggressive machismo.
I'm allowed to say this because my wife. So my wife is autistic, and she's read a lot about female autism. And what's really interesting is that there's this theory that autism is a masculinized brain, right? So male autists, all of the pattern recognition, visual, spatial skills that men tend to be a little bit better at, they tend to be grossly better at. And then the emotional, more social intelligence that women tend to be better at, they tend to be less good at. This is the prevailing theory that she explained to me. So autistic women, she said, have minds, they're masculinized female minds, so they end up being similar to like average males in their preferences. And so her theory, because she's an avid gamer, her gamer scores on Xbox is 100 times, literally 100 times higher than mine. We met at a club and when we started talking about our favorite video game, and I was like, I played 100 hours of Oblivion, and she was like, I played 300 hours of Oblivion. And so her theory is that a lot of the women that are into these games are women like her. They're women with undiagnosed autism who have somewhat masculine brains, which I find really fascinating. So anyway, if someone hates that opinion and finds it controversial, it's her fault.
It might be. It
might be.
It might be. I'm not going to deny that there is a strong correlation between heavy D&D stats nerds and autism. Like,
oh my gosh, of course, it's such a correlation that my server is filled with jokes about it. Like, they constantly are referencing it. I mean, I think 50% of them are openly diagnosed autists. 50, like, and I'm not exaggerating. So, yeah.
It's just one of those things.
It's just one of those things, and it's okay. It's okay. I don't personally think it's a pejorative. My wife says it's a superpower. Who am I to argue with that?
Well, this has been really fun, Alex. I appreciate you taking the time to talk about all this stuff. When I'm assuming ACKS 2 isn't out yet. When are you hoping to launch that?
Well, I was hoping for November, but we hit some delays in delivery of the artwork, just because there's so much artwork required. So it's looking like PDF September and books in early 2025.
Yeah, the art I was looking at for your books, for most of it's pretty good.
Yeah, I mean,
it does remind me of that red book cover.
Yeah, I've got a large team of artists, international, working on it. We've got some of it is painted illustration, some of it is graphic novel style. So basically, the covers and the chapter entries are all full painted Frazetta style, and then the interior art is comic book style. So, yeah, should be a really nice looking book.
All right, and like you said, you have July 16th.
July 18th on BackerKit.
That's right, July 18th, BackerKit, not GoFundMe. I end up calling everything GoFundMe. Like, how like when you're growing up and your mom calls all the video games to Nintendo? Kind of like that.
Yep. Yeah, Star Spangled Squadron Volume 2, my graphic novel. You'll be able to pick up Volume 1 in the crowdfunding campaign as well. It's part of Comictopia, which is a special project being run by BackerKit to promote independent comics.
All right. Sounds pretty cool. So people, if you liked what you heard here today, definitely check out ACKS. ACKS is pretty cool. And check out his BackerKit project, Star Spangled Squadron Volume 2. There, I got it right that time.
There it is.
All right, Alex, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me on.
We're going to wrap it. Yeah, no, I enjoy listening to you. You're a very intelligent man. You always have an interesting perspective that's different from others. So I find you a fascinating guy. So I appreciate you willing to talk to me.
A little too different for my own good, but that's all right.
It's like we said, we need all kinds of autists.
That's right. All right, man. Well, thanks for having me on. I'll see you soon.
All right. Take care. Thank you very much for taking the time to watch CultureScape today. It's just such a great show. I really enjoy sharing this with you guys. It is really the highlight of my week when I come up with these episodes. Sometimes it takes a lot of effort, but it's worth it. I feel like with CultureScape, we've been able to really dive into these topics from a more positive perspective, from a very much understanding the building of things, not just tearing everything down. There's so many YouTube channels, and really this space is dominated by channels that are just like, tear this down, tear that down. And look, sometimes tear down is required. I'm not saying it isn't, but I think we need to sometimes take a step back and try to appreciate why we like geek culture, why we like tabletop gaming, for example, in the first place. So all of those who have supported us here on CultureScape, thank you so much for doing that. Of course, you can find us on the CultureScape Patreon. You can support us there. And you can always find the show on YouTube, Spotify, wherever else you like to listen or watch your podcast. And again, to the people that helped put this show together, huge shout out to Bain Books Publishing and imprint of Simon & Schuster. They have been awesome. They've helped us set up so many great guests before and in the past. They're awesome. And of course, Young Voices, a journalism advocacy organization. They are fantastic. Thank you also to them. And of course, to all of you viewers, you're the reason why I do this. I love getting feedback. When I get those comments to say, awesome interview, I really liked this, or you should get this guest and you should talk about this thing next. That feedback is amazing. So please continue sending it. I want to hear what you would like to see or hear on the show. And if you're watching this on the YouTube, don't forget to like, subscribe, and click that bell. Well then, guys, without any more talking, we will let this go. Until next time, my friends, keep geeking out. Hey there, gang! If you are a fan of CultureScape, and I know you are, and want to get involved in supporting the show, well, now you can! By joining the CultureScape Patreon, you'll help support me and my editor Chris as we create the show and produce more quality journalism. For just $5 or $10 a month, you not only help us, but get access to our exclusive members-only Discord. You'll also get to vote on and suggest new guests for the interview. So if you are a fellow weeb and love CultureScape, then come join us today on Patreon.